Okay, here is my video 1 of everything about interest rates. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about how interest is relative appreciation between assets. So what do we mean by that appreciation? So whenever you have something that increases in value over time, that's considered to be appreciation, okay? Now, interest is just a specific way to measure appreciation over time as a percentage change, okay? So if your house is worth $100,000 this year and next year it's worth $110,000, then that would correspond with a 10% appreciation, and we would measure that as a 10% rate of interest, okay? Now, when we talk about interest rates, we're generally going to think about assets that have a steady kind of appreciation. So we'll get into more why this maybe doesn't necessarily make sense because of the concept of present value. So if an appreciation is known, then we can account for that in the current price. But for now, that's just interest is a great concept to apply to things that have very consistent appreciation. Okay, now when we talk about interest rates, there's going to be 3 main classes of assets that we are going to consider. So the first class of assets is money itself. The second is consumer commodities. The third is financial assets. Okay, so we aren't going to be talking about maybe industrial commodities or stuff like that, but consumer commodities, everything that would be involved in the consumer price index. So food, housing, rent, utilities, things like that, okay? So we have money, consumer commodities, and financial assets. So when we say things appreciate, we need to have something to compare them to measure that appreciation. You can't measure price without some type of comparison. Okay, now price, as opposed to physics, in physics, when you use units, your unit types will always match. But when we denominate prices always involve comparing incommensurables. What does that mean, incommensurable? Well, it always involves comparing 2 different things that aren't the same type of thing or unit or whatever. So a price is the way we compare incommensurables according to a certain value system or exchange system or something like that. Okay, so when we try to apply ideas from normal sciences to economics and social sciences, we have to realize that there is no what's called dimensional analysis, which is basically like what type of units you're using, whether you're doing distance, weight, density, all that thing. So dimensional analysis doesn't really work on quantities in economics because prices are about comparing incommensurables on a common scale of value system for exchange. Okay, but other than that, the concept of relativity is actually very analogous between our financial world of social science and the physical sciences. Okay, so when we talk about relativity, obviously people are going to think of Einstein's theory of relativity, which has 2 parts, general and special relativity. Now that theory is about certain relationships between time and space that are maybe counterintuitive and unconventional. But in addition to those general and special relativity, where these type of relativistic mechanics, there's also what's called classical relativity. So even without our Einsteinian physics, you have you are always going to measure speed relative to other objects. So if you are measuring the speed of a train, you're going to measure that relative to the ground. If you're going to measure the speed of the earth, you're going to measure that relative to the sun, okay? Now, you don't need any Einsteinian relativistic effects to have this concept of relativity. So that would be called classical relativity, where we don't discuss distortions in space and time, or the Lorentz transformations or stuff like that. But so this idea of classical relativity, which is we measure displacement and speed in a frame of reference relative to other objects, that is going to apply to our world of finance, where we measure appreciation of one asset relative to another. So you don't really have a scale of measurement unless you have something to compare something to, okay? So money is commonly used for that purpose. But then we also have consumer commodities. So the difference between using money as the scale of comparison and consumer commodities is, when you use money, you're going to be talking about nominal things like nominal GDP, nominal interest rates, nominal, I guess you wouldn't say nominal rate of inflation, because that would always be zero. But then when we compare them to consumer commodities, we're going to be talking about real interest rates, a real rate of inflation, real prices, things like that. Okay, so we generally consider consumer commodities to have a stable price across time, even though it could become easier or more difficult to source these resources, or they could change in abundance, or even relative value can change a lot. But when we measure things like inflation, we have something called a consumer price index, which we just basically average the price of a whole bunch of these commodities, so that we can get a very solid, I guess you could say, reference frame for measuring the appreciation between these assets. So when we talk about these three asset classes, typically your money is going to decline in value, and that has you can call that by two different names. You can call it inflation or depreciation. And it's ironic that inflation goes with depreciation and deflation goes with appreciation, but it's important to recognize that these terms often involve different perspectives, so that's why the language can be confusing. So when your money is decreasing in value, which is generally the expected thing, then you're going to have inflation or depreciation of that money. Okay? So money is expected to go down in value over time. And there's lots of conventional economic reasons for this and why that's stabilizing and doesn't lead to... A lot of this comes from gold standard legacies, where you would have deflationary episodes. So they tried to make money inflationary so that you wouldn't have deflationary spikes where people's feedback, where people start hoarding money more and more. Okay, now our consumer commodities, like we said, we generally understand that to be stable in value over time, or as even our definition of value. So even though you could try to make cases for like in a famine, food is rare, so your commodities are going to probably increase in nominal price. And you could argue that objectively those commodities are more valuable in a scenario where they're harder to source or more critical. Okay, so, and maybe we have the price stays the same, but we just have so much overall abundance that we're like, oh, we have plenty of food, we have plenty of water, we don't really care. So there's more to this than just price level and comparing value over time. You have to look at the whole situation of the system, but generally we consider consumer commodities to be stable in value. Okay, now the final asset class is going to be our financial assets. Now, based on conventional thinking and conventional wisdom about interest rates, conventional thinking about interest rates, financial assets are supposed to appreciate in value over time. And the idea is that you as a person will use your resources to generate more resources, okay? Now, there have been periods where people talk about, oh, your interest rate should be about 7% and your money should double about every 10 years, or maybe 7 years, I forget. I think it was 7 years, rule of 7. But that, historically speaking, may not be the most realistic expectation. If we look at growth of different things throughout history, it's going to be a lot slower than that, especially if you go back before the agricultural revolution and before the antithesis of the origins of accounting and writing and things like that. So yeah, actually some of the earliest forms of writing were actually accounting and keeping track of debts and exchange. So that's quite interesting. But generally, instead of always thinking financial assets should appreciate, maybe we hope that they would, but we recognize there are a lot of different circumstances and outcomes. I usually like to use the word contingencies, which may or may not make that a realistic situation. Okay, now financial assets, their purpose is to divide up social claims to wealth. Okay, so when someone has a financial asset, there's going to be some type of political account or accounting entity, or maybe even just a cultural group or a tribe where that financial asset is recognized as having value and is a meaningful symbol or even a token of exchange. Okay, some type of socially recognized and valid symbol. Okay, so now I want to talk about equilibrium rates real quick. So interest is just going to be our relative appreciation, either compared to money. Interest compared to money is nominal interest rate. And then our interest compared to consumer commodities is our real interest rate. Okay, one interesting thing about consumer commodities is even a lot of them may not be available at different points in time. So basically you have to look at the commodities that are available across the time scale you're looking at. One great example is, well, obviously technology, new technologies like cell phones, computers, even books, they may not have been available across those timescales, or even like before the printing press, even if there were books, they would not be thought of in the same way. So we get our two basic ways of measuring interest or relative appreciation, the nominal interest rate and our real interest rate. Now let's talk about real briefly what this idea of the equilibrium rate. The idea is it's based on this division of assets into the three asset classes. So the idea is that financial assets will equilibrate among themselves and people will move more, or they'll invest more in financial assets with a higher rate of appreciation. So all financial assets will have a completely level rate of appreciation once they equilibrate, assuming markets are efficient and all that. But if we consider money is a financial asset, then that theory breaks down, and it becomes clear that the only equilibrium rate that is possible is 0. Okay, now if you separate money into a distinct thing, then you can have a positive equilibrium rate relative to money. But I think that's sort of a mistake to think about money differently. So that's one obvious reason why equilibrium rate is wrong. The other one is, so first of all, money and financial assets not inherently different. And the second reason why equilibrium is wrong is because money and financial assets do not inherently have an opportunity cost. So the idea is that depending on where you put financial assets, that represents an opportunity cost. But the reality is that's just your accounting information, and the opportunity cost is actually how the financial group that is defining those assets is using resources. Okay, so we're just gonna put that in a simple way right now. Only real resources have opportunity cost. Okay, now there may be opportunity costs to individuals from a certain perspective, but for the community, accounting community as a whole, there is not an opportunity cost for their allocation of financial assets. Okay, now the third thing. Okay, so typically interest rates are used in debt contracts. Okay, this is like when you get a credit card, when you get a mortgage, when you even when you sign a lease, that could be considered a debt contract. There may be fees and interest rates applied to default and stuff, but so an interest rate is going to be, in this context, is going to be a fixed contractual appreciation. Okay, so when you take out a loan, you are swapping two assets for each other, and then when you pay it back, you are swapping those assets back. So what are the two assets? Two assets of a loan. Your debt slash I'm just going to put your credit, and then you get money. Okay, so the way I describe that is a loan is the cost is going to be your the exchange you need to perform to upgrade your credit or your debt to be spendable. The cost to upgrade your credit or to be spendable. So if everyone just accepted your credit, then you wouldn't need to upgrade your credit. You wouldn't need money. Your debt would actually function as money. So you would pay someone with your credit, and they could in turn use that credit to pay someone else. Okay, so if you had perfect credit and everyone knew you had perfect credit, you would not need, perfect credit means you don't have to upgrade your debt slash credit, and it works as money. Okay. Now, but generally, our credit and our debt is not a perfect substitute, and so we have to upgrade it, and I'll get into that more. Okay, so if you take out a loan, they give you $100 of money, and you give them $100 of debt, but the interest rate applies to your debt. So your debt is going to increase in value, which means you owe more, and you will actually have to pay back more money to switch back. Okay, so it's just an asset swap. So you give away your debt, you get money, then you give back money, and you get back your debt. So paying off your debt is getting your debt back. So you're just swapping back. Paying off your debt is getting your debt back. And there's no reason to hold on to your own debt, so you just cancel that out and it ceases to exist. Okay. Now I did want to mention endogenous money, and this idea of financial system upgrades its own assets to create money. Now, endogenous money contrasts with the idea of exogenous money, which means that money comes from the central bank, or money is just gold out there or whatever. So endogenous money is the idea that financial system creates its own money. Okay. And that's all I wanted to cover in this first video. And hopefully that wasn't too confusing with those segues into relativity. The point is, you just have to measure the relative appreciation or depreciation of assets compared to something else. Otherwise, there's no fixed point of reference.